The hand-to-hand arts are some of the more fun weapons to come out of the DLC, and this weapon type is actually very comparable to things like fist-based weapons, in that they're really close range and quick-based striking options. Now the differences being is that these will actually do less damage, less stance damage, but just typically have faster movesets, which unfortunately for the hand-to-hand weapons, they have to compete with things like the Star Fist and the Iron Balls, and those have heavy attacks that are literally faster than the heavy attacks of these weapons, and combined with this boosted damage and boosted stance damage, they tend to be pretty outclassed, but they do have their own specific things going for them that make them still be a very viable and good option, especially with some of the recent updates that actually has brought upon some buffs. Since the release of the DLC, they have since gotten some more damage, and they also do have a speed increase with their uncharged heavy attacks. And the heavy attacks is actually what makes these very viable, because unironically, the uncharged heavy attack is just faster than the light attack combos. So basically every single time that I'm using these weapons, I'm just spamming heavy attacks, whether they be uncharged or fully charged. They're just going to make you do more damage, do more stance damage, have them come out a bit faster. And they also do have this little AoE effect, which makes them actually extend the range a bit further and make it actually have a larger hitbox, which is probably good at hitting multiple enemies at once. So if you like the aesthetic of fist-based weapons, but you didn't really care much for the Star Fist due to their really short range and pretty boring movesets, I would recommend going with the hand-to-hand weapons, as these heavy attack combos are going to be more versatile and easier to use. Now, another thing that these actually have going for them is going to be their weapon skill options. They definitely don't have as many compared to some of the other weapon types, as they do miss out on a lot of different types of skills that hit with the weapon directly, and a lot of different types of weapon buffs, because unfortunately this weapon type cannot be buffed at all with things like Crag Blade or Flaming Strike, or even spells like Blood Flame Blade. But they do have their own two specific skills in Palm Blast and DRYLEAF Whirlwind, which are both very solid options. And in almost every single time that I'm building around these weapons, I'm probably going to use one or the other. DRYLEAF Whirlwind is probably better for status effect types of builds, but Palm Blast I think is just a better one overall. And it's kind of the one that I actually have the most fun with as well. For 14 FP, it does do this like little punching attack, which doesn't do like the most amazing damage, does like okay stance damage, and just gets a little bit of hype armor. Like honestly, it's not really that good of a skill to use uncharged, because the heavy attacks and uncharged heavy attacks will just directly outclass it. But the fully charged version is definitely where it shines, because this thing basically has infinite hype armor to where you can just tank basically anything in the game, and just trade out with bosses in this one massive punching attack that could do amazing damage, do over 30 stance damage, and actually go really far as well. Like this is actually deceptively large range to the point where it actually can be served as like a nice AoE projectile. Like this skill can just cheese so many different types of enemies and bosses. All smaller types of enemies are going to get sent flying to the ground. And if you're having problems reading a boss's moveset, you could just fully charge this thing up and probably end up trading out with them, unless you are like at really higher levels and you don't really have many defenses, so you're probably going to take a whole bunch of damage. So in those instances, I wouldn't really bother, but it still is a very nice complement to the weapon itself that doesn't really get any hype armor and can kind of lack that range. Now, as for a DRYLEAF Whirlwind, I did say it actually might be better for status effect types of builds, and that is because of its multi-hit potential. Now, the DPS of this skill is probably not going to be as good as like the uncharged heavy attack spam, and in that time that you actually use the entire skill, you could probably just do more stance damage as well. But for only 9 FP and its stun lock potential, and its ability to actually proc the multi-hit talismans and proc status effects, it definitely makes it very useful. Now, against bosses that don't really give you longer openings, it's probably not going to be the most useful thing, as I only really see it as like a useful option for those smaller types of enemies. Otherwise, I would just go in a different direction, because the heavy attacks are probably going to work better in this instance against these types of bosses. So if you were going to go like a frost type of build, let's say, which I definitely think is the best status effect build for these weapons, as I think with a bleed infusion, it gets pretty poor damage, especially like at lower levels. At higher levels, it might be perfectly fine, but the damage is definitely just not there. But with a cold infusion, you get really good scalings, and an alternative to DRYLEAF Whirlwind might end up being things like Divine Beast Frost Dump, or if you just like the moveset of the weapon itself, then you could use the Shriek of Sorrow skill, as this is the only weapon buff available to the hand-to-hand arts. Now, there are only 2 different weapons in this hand-to-hand art weapon category, in both the DRYLEAF arts and the Dane's Footwork. Now, the DRYLEAF arts I think is the better one overall, but if you actually wanted to go for guard countering builds, I would go with the Dane's Footwork, which unironically, it actually is one of the best guard countering weapons in the game, as I will get into. But to go over the differences of the weapons, there really isn't that many. They both get basically the exact same range. Their damage, scalings, weight, all identical. Like the only real differences will be things like their moveset, and there really isn't even that much of a difference there as well. The first and last attack in the light attack combo chain is different, and the heavy attacks are different. Now, to start off with the light attacks, the DRYLEAF arts will get the punching attacks with its first and last light, where the Dane's Footwork will typically get kicking attacks. Now, they both get the exact same damage, but the DRYLEAF arts are actually faster, so it can just output higher DPS, but the Dane's Footwork are actually kicking attacks, so therefore it can actually work with the buffs like the Divine Bird Warrior's Greaves and the Shattered Stone Talisman, which with these buffs, it can just output higher DPS. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, I don't ever bother using the light attacks of these weapons, as the heavy attacks just directly outclass it. Like, the uncharged heavy attacks are just faster than the light attacks. And in that instance, the DRYLEAF art is just going to be the better option, because the heavy attacks of the DRYLEAF arts not only do more damage, but they also do more stance damage, and they're also faster. And this is both included for the uncharged and the fully charged version. The Dane's Footwork does actually get a bit more kicking attacks with this heavy attack combo, so using things like the Shattered Stone Talisman or the Divine Bird Warrior Greaves, you might think it'd be a bit better, and it actually does do a bit more damage, but I still would just rather have the DRYLEAF arts, because the DRYLEAF arts also does get some kicking attacks with its heavy attack chain, but the added speed that it gets and the more stance damage that it does get, I would just much rather go with the DRYLEAF arts. And I think the DRYLEAF arts build with the uncharged heavy attacks paired alongside Palm Blast is like an amazing and really fun build to use. Because yeah, that follow-up heavy attack, whether it's charged or uncharged, is just amazing. It comes out fast, actually has decent range with its nice lunge, does amazing damage and amazing stance damage. Now, I did mention that the Dane's Footwork is going to be better for guard counters, and that is because for whatever reason, when you do two-hand this thing and go get a guard counter, it just gets more damage and more stance damage than the DRYLEAF arts. It's basically the exact same animation, but there's like some weird bug going on to where it just hits multiple times. And sometimes it could just do 50% more damage and 50% more stance damage, but there are other times where it can do almost twice as much damage and twice as much stance damage. Like, this guard counter could do 40 stance damage, and it's basically in an instant. And paired alongside the deflecting tier and the curved sword talisman, you could be doing colossal sword types of damage and stance damage, which is just absurd for a really small and quick weapon like this one. So if this guard countering build does actually seem a bit fun to you, then I recommend just going with the Dane's Footwork. But unfortunately, when picking these weapons, you are going to sacrifice the slightly worse heavy attack. But even then, the heavy attacks can still serve perfectly fine, but they're just not going to be as good as the DRYLEAF arts in my opinion, and that's probably the reason why I'm going to value that one a bit more overall, but they're both going to be very solid A tier options. Okay, that is that one now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. The next video is going to be the perfume bottles. There are 5 of them in total, and they all kind of work the exact same way, but we're still going to rank them, and honestly, you might be surprised with some of my takes in that video. So definitely do subscribe for that one. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye!